All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Tyler Skluzacek. I'm a graduate student at the University of Chicago, presenting on behalf of my co-authors Ryan Wong, Zhuzhao Li, Ryan Chard, Kyle Chard, and Ian Foster. And today I'm going to tell you about a really cool metadata extraction system we constructed and ran on super big data that also uses serverless computing under the hood. So, to set the scene for you guys a little bit, we're going to start with thinking about how data are created in science, right? And so they're kind of created in this way that's like this ever-expanding snowball in which you might acquire data from like a raw scientific instrument, an IoT device, or even a supercomputing simulation. You take that raw data, you move it over to Jupyter notebooks, Excel spreadsheets, or you could be the unfortunate intern who's forced to, manually pour through and patch null values. Then you actually use this data to create these visualizations, even more research artifacts, including, machine learning models and even findings that you want to communicate somehow, perhaps even via like social media. And then you publish. So you might put them in a dedicated resource, such as the Materials Data Facility for Materials Science Data at Argonne National Lab. You might publish your model into DL Hub at UChicago. If you just want to take, like a file system of data and like publish it or share it with a certain group, you can use Globus and Globus shared endpoints, or even this presentation counts as publishing. And then finally, there's some decision that has to be made about preserving or destroying this data that creates yet another version of data where you might filter down and only keep the elements you want. You might, zip them up and store them away with lock and key, maybe at a library or, in your own repository. And then even like you have this like data reduction problem too, right? So you might not want to keep everything, but you might want to throw something away. So one researcher in one institution can slowly start to like develop a lot of data from their research data lifecycle. But as we can probably assume, preserved doesn't necessarily mean useful, right? You might have all of these scientists publishing the sum of their research data life cycles back into this central data lake, which is kind of an uncool term now that just describes, like a pile of unstructured data. But at some point, other people are going to want to come in and think of this data in terms of FAIR, right? Whether they want to search through it and find things or, access data that they saw you publish in a paper. They might want to use your data for another purpose, or they might want to even try to reproduce your study. Unfortunately, to do that, this data lake needs some sort of thing to search on. It needs an index of searchable, rich metadata in order to answer these types of questions that scientists might have. And files are chock full of metadata, right? So to quickly, metadata are just data about data. And so let's imagine like this picture of a dog. So this picture has entities, dogs, trees, leaves. It's, taken as context. It was taken in Ann Arbor. Information, it's 377 kilobytes. It seems small. It might have information that's only interesting to like a machine learning model or to a graphic designer, such as like the dimensions or these color histograms that might be able to help you, cluster images that might be similar. And then you might even have like this hierarchical relationship, such as here, you might have a dog, his name is Spot, just metadata about dogs. It doesn't really apply to anything else. But manual metadata extraction is interesting in that it's super difficult. As soon as you introduce humans into this problem, it becomes a super difficult one. So imagine you are, the librarian trying to build your repository, and you ask the creator of the image, tell me everything you can. That's my dog Spot. Well, it's incomplete, and it's innately not scalable, right? So if you have like 5,500 pictures on your iPhone, no one is going to want to go answer every single question you might have. And then you could even think about doing this at scale is even harder. So at Argonne National Lab, they have this repository called Petrel that has 4 petabytes of data, 50 million files, and it's not even like the biggest one in existence. Like a lot of these companies have, exabytes of data that they tout that they secretly store and don't share with anyone. But even internally, this is a big problem. Like, how do you search or make these data fair, F-A-I-R? And then if you move these data across multiple repositories, such as like, having some things on your laptop versus having your machine learning model on the resource versus having that thing you zipped up on your Google Drive, super, super difficult. And so we propose, and we're not the first ones to propose, but we kind of try to define automated metadata extraction in terms of these things we call extraction plans, right? So an extraction plan at a high level just takes a file or a group of files, applies one or more extraction functions to it, and then returns some metadata document, probably popularly in JSON, I would presume. And so this kind of file to metadata process is what we call an extraction plan. But this can become interesting when you have like multiple metadata extraction functions, right? So here you have one file, you might want to get, here this is a function to get the word count. But then later on you might, based on that word count, you might want to get the time that this file was last modified. And you might have these two metadata documents now that need to be merged into one. The extraction plan becomes slightly more complicated. Then you can even introduce the dimension of having multiple files that all exist as one logical entity, push them all through an extraction function, and then create one coherent metadata document. And so here's kind of a list of all of the possible extraction plans, but at a high level, an automated metadata extraction workflow should work as follows for each file group. It should identify what files should be grouped together. One common one in material science is you have files that are called in-car, out-car, post-car. They all exist together by themselves. They mean very little. You generate an extraction plan. So what do you do with that group of files? Which extractors do you apply to it? And then you execute that extractor plan. And you can, while you're executing, you can even change it. You might realize something in some of your metadata that informs using an extractor later on. And we noticed that this metadata extraction problem fits pretty well with a lot of the strengths of Faas, or function as a service. So we noticed that these extraction jobs are inherently bursty. So you might want to sweep over an entire repository or a folder when you're ingesting it. These extraction functions, these extractors, can be generally lightweight and containerized. So like you can package all the dependencies, even machine learning models, into a container. And these data are oftentimes stored across edge resources, and especially in the case of like IoT or just having like a multi-cloud system, in which centralized processing incurs unnecessary transfer costs, right? Like you can dominate your entire extraction time by just transfer alone. And then in the case where we do have like other edge resources that we're not using, could we utilize them in such a way to make the overall extraction faster or of higher throughput? And so last year at HPDC, Ryan Chard of our group presented FunkX, which is a federated fast system that, it runs on diverse cyber infrastructure. So it's great for this edge computing model. It elastically provisions to match demand, so you're not just wasting compute cycles, and it's, inherently able to be bursted. It can effectively scale on large resources such as supercomputers, hence the scalability. And then it supports batching, prefetching, and container scheduling, all these knobs you can turn to, actually make a metadata extraction system pretty fast. And so we propose the following research question, which is, can Faas infrastructure enable the creation of scalable, efficient, decentralized metadata extraction workflows for large and distributed scientific data? So we present Xtract, known as XMeta, to our double-blind reviewers, that remotely orchestrates extraction plans across distributed data. So it's a cloud service that, does all sorts of different things, but I'll just walk through this component by component really quick. But first, a user communicates with it. There's a registry of extractors, which are just fast functions that might be tied to a container. There's a container registry that matches the container registry on each endpoint. And then there's a metadata registry, less important. That's what happens at the end. And then, so the step one is you want to crawl a repository, right? So you use API calls via Globus, Google Drive, or just raw HTTPS to communicate with a repository to actually build out the file tree. And as part of that, you want to notice files that are in the same directory and group them together accordingly. So the person submitting the metadata extraction workflow will also include a grouping function, usually by name or by extension, to denote files that need to be classified as one coherent object. And then what happens is you have to make some sort of decision about where data should be processed. As we mentioned before, you don't want to necessarily move all your data to a centralized resource, but you might want to move them along the edge. And so we have this prefetcher that's kind of, puts files into these blocks and moves the blocks between the compute facilities. Then the Xtract executes the extractor plan. Sorry, it's kind of hot in here. It's like June. It does the extractor plan. It executes it, and is sending these extractors via FunkX to each of these endpoints. So Xtract is always aware of where any given file is. It's just trying to, efficiently and as quickly as possible, with as high throughput as possible, send these functions to the endpoints. And so each, facility, as we'll call it, has a FunkX endpoint on it that is capable of computing. And then finally, at the very end, metadata are validated. We don't really evaluate that. That's just kind of a schema thing that occurs after the metadata extraction. And so in doing this, we introduce a few optimizations. First, and probably most interesting, is the min transfers algorithm. So let's say you crawl and you identify 3 groups, group 1, 2, and 3, such that group 1 contains all of the files. All the files should be clustered together. Group 2 contains one of the files. Group 3 contains another one of the files. And let's say all of these are stored on endpoint C and have to be shipped out because there's no actual compute layer. It might be like a small machine attached to a scientific instrument that's only for staging. And so in this case, if we move group 1 and 3 to endpoint A and group 2 to endpoint B, then file A is transferred twice. And that's what we would call like transfer waste or a double transfer. And the min transfers algorithm is supposed to avoid that by creating these batches of families, or we call them families, which is like a collection of groups. There's too many batch names, I think. Maybe next time we'll just have like tiers of batching or something. But I digress. So the idea is that you create a graph of your directory where each file is a vertex. The vertices, I guess I can show this from the next graph. Vertices connecting the files represent existence within the same group, as said by the grouping function. And then you have all of these connected components. And let's say you have like a maximum number of files you can possibly send. Like let's say like this isn't, you have 100,000 files in a directory and you can't possibly send them all in one family. Then you identify connected components that might be too large. So if our max size is 4, this just fits. This big component doesn't fit. So then what we do is we take this family B, as we'll call it, and we'll iteratively run this well-known algorithm called Karger's randomized global min cut that just creates supernodes randomly. It's very fast and it gets an approximately correct min cut such that the the last break between 2 sets of files is going to be roughly minimizing the number of double or extra transfers. Optimization 2 is batching. So batching is pretty straightforward, right? We want to avoid swamping funcex and the endpoints with requests. We don't want to, send too much of a data size by having repeated elements such as authorization headers with every request. And we want to maximize the overall throughput. So there's a couple knobs we can turn in batching, and it's batching at the client level via Xtract and actually batching like within funcex requests. And so here's kind of an illustration of what that looks like. So without any batching, you have 6 separate tasks. With Xtract batching of size 3, you might group 3 families into one family batch. And then when you send it to funcex, you're sending it, as like a one task that funcex will then break up and send to places appropriately. And then finally, and this one's pretty interesting, but it's simple, is it's file group offloading, right? So let's say you have a main compute resource, right, like a huge compute cluster or a supercomputer, and you have more work than can be done at a time by the supercomputer. So let's say the supercomputer is congested. Well, if you have an idle edge of resources, you might want to send n% of your data, like the total amount of data, to those edge resources to be processed, such that n is large enough to remove load from your original resource, but it's also small enough so that the edge resources aren't your stragglers in the end. Like you don't want to send away too much data that it finishes too fast. And this is only triggered when we receive signal that the main resource is saturated. We'll show results about this in a second, but we do show that there's like a happy medium in that if you transfer like the perfect amount, you're faster than the main resource doing everything and also sending way too much to the edge for computing. And so this slide is mostly here for people who want to look at the slides later. I'm not going to walk through the tech specs, but just know that we use a lot of things and that Xtract is hosted on AWS and it uses a couple services. And you can kind of map the services to the architecture diagram a few slides ago. But we use the Theta supercomputer at Argonne. It's big and fast. We use the UChicago Research Computing Cluster, which is big but not as big and pretty fast. We use UChicago River, which just shows that we can use Kubernetes. We have the Jetstream shared cloud instance that's basically free to use and unlimited allocation roughly, so we used it for all sorts of stuff. And Petrel, which is a high-performance data transfer node. Well, it's a data facility that has high-performance data transfer nodes, on which a lot of the materials data facility data that we operate on live. Speaking of the materials data facility, these are our good friends at Argonne National Lab. So they have 61 terabytes of data, 2.2 million file groups of data from numerous institutions, and over 11,000 unique file extensions. And so just to jump straight into the evaluation, we show that Xtract is scalable to at least 2048 concurrent workers. So we kind of look at a couple of use cases here. First, we look at image sort, which just takes an image and it sorts it into buckets: photograph, scientific diagram, etc. And we scaled to a fixed batch size across all jobs of 8, just to show apples to apples comparisons. But image sort is fairly lightweight and it doesn't scale inherently well, right? But materials I/O, which is a series of extractors submitted by Argonne National Lab and implemented by them, sees reasonable but imperfect scaling on 200,000 file groups, and it sees reasonable scaling up to 4096. Like, the line is still curved and kind of mapping ideal slightly, but for the sticklers in the audience, we'll say it scales pretty well to 2048 concurrent workers. And the weak scaling statistics are right here. We also looked at each component step by step and all Faas overheads therein. So we noticed the Faas overheads are relatively small compared to the extraction and transfer time, which is kind of a place you want to be. So the first thing your eyes might be drawn to is this large number on the amount of time it takes to crawl over 3 seconds. But this is amortized over many files and many directories being crawled. The reason it takes so long is it kind of has like a cold start cost of sending just one request, because this was just us trying to take a snapshot of how long it takes to truly process one file group. You'll notice that Xtract and funcex have relatively small overheads that are, amortized somewhat by batching. But then the bottlenecks are kind of where we want them to be. So first, the highest bottleneck, if assuming crawling isn't a bottleneck, which I'll show in a minute, we can relax that assumption. But transfer takes the longest amount of time. So it's best to avoid this whenever possible. That's kind of one of our main theses in this work. And then bottleneck 2 is the actual extraction itself. So here we show the extraction takes a significant amount of time, but this is where the actual value add is in the metadata extraction process. Like, a metadata extractor could take a little bit of time or a long amount of time, but it's truly the thing that should be causing us to go slow, not the stuff in between, right? And so this is just end-to-end component latency of a 2 megabyte text file. And then we kind of started to measure some of our optimizations. We included most of them in the presentation. There's a couple more that are in the paper. But here we show, like, batching. We can tune both knobs, the Xtract batching and the funcex batching, and around 8x8 or 32x8 we notice is kind of like the 2 possible peaks. And so we notice that batching is a good thing, right? It's throughput's maximized somewhere in the middle. But then this min transfers diagram is actually a huge deal, right, in the case that you do have to transfer data. And basically, we can think of this in 2 cases, right? You have your case where you're transferring from a highly performant node, like a highly performant transfer node, and a non so highly performant, maybe a slow transfer node. So Midway doesn't have the giant, transfer capabilities like Argonne National Lab, because like Petrol has like these high performance data transfer nodes, like they're dedicated for just this. And so on Midway, you don't have that. So you'll notice there's a gap between using the min transfer algorithm and not using the min transfers algorithm, such that the min transfer algorithm takes up to 1,600 seconds faster, nearly a half hour just to transfer the data for just 100,000 files. Imagine that over like 2 million files. That's a huge benefit. You'll notice a much smaller, like as I mentioned before, a much smaller benefit when using the min transfer versus not using it on a fast data node, because basically you're just pushing data through as fast as possible. What's a few extra wasteful transfers, right? When transfer is necessary, Xtract processes files nearly as quickly as they arrive, which is kind of exactly where we want to be, right? So we notice here that if you look at this dotted line that represents crawling, it is never a bottleneck, kind of as I described before, but you didn't believe me, but now you believe me. We transfer, we take everything we need to transfer, we put it into blocks and try to concurrently transfer them out, right? And so eventually, as they start arriving in the step function way, and we scale up the number of extractor workers that are actually processing these data, we notice that when we get up to 32 nodes, we are basically hugging the lines. That means files arrive, they're extracted, moving on, which is ideal, compared to in this like 4x28 scenario, which is where they're just kind of extracted slowly and leisurely until, a couple hours go by, or an hour goes by. We also looked at using idle resources to our benefit and actually evaluating the offloading. So here, we use the Midway 2 cluster, and as our primary resource, we give it too much work, and we send the extra work to 4 Jetstream instances, each with like 10 workers or something small. And we noticed that, if you transfer 0 or 20%, you're pretty much like in that non-optimal territory in terms of time. But if you transfer 10% of your data, then you're actually seeing performance benefit. And during the shepherding process for HPDC, our reviewers actually recommended that we compare against one of our, like another leading metadata extraction tool that is Apache Tika. And so we kind of configured each of these Jetstream instances to, one, they could run funcx and funcx endpoints and use Xtract workers. But in the second case, they could actually just use Apache Tika and Apache Tika extractors and actually, just read from a folder as soon as they arrive via Globus transfer. So pretty much the exact same setup. And we noticed this kind of the same idea there, that if you transfer just part of the data away from Midway, there's actual performance benefit. I'm not going to tout that we are slightly faster than Apache Tika, only because we kind of took the centralized Apache Tika and morphed it into a model that was, in our decentralized framework. So it's not maybe how it's supposed to be used in the wild, but it was our best way of creating an apples-to-apples comparison. And then finally, probably our largest experiment was we processed 60 terabytes of data, 2.2 million file groups, using the Theta supercomputer at Argonne in just over 6 hours. There's a couple of interesting things we noticed in doing this, right? So first is there's this giant black line here. So what that means is Theta has these allocations that limit you to exactly 6 hours. So here is kind of an extension beyond 6 hours. So the idea is that we have to checkpoint by writing metadata to file asynchronously. It's not too costly, even though Theta has a slow file system. But the idea is like you can just pick this up and keep going as soon as the checkpoint comes offline. So in full transparency, this black restart, based on how supercomputing allocations work, isn't an end and a start right away. It's an end, you get back onto the supercomputing queue, and then it's another start. But that start basically allows us to, pick up exactly where we left off. The reviewers mentioned like, hey, what's going on with this like giant spike in the beginning? I was like, that's a good question. So we dug into that a little more, and we found that this throughput spike is caused by these long-running ASE file type extractors. But yeah, that's kind of why there was that giant spike, because there's some number of workers that are congested. We extracted a Google Drive repository on a Kubernetes cluster, mostly just to showcase the flexibility of our model. And so you'll see here we have like 5 different extractors, non-material science extractors, because the anonymous grad students Google Drive repo we looked at was not material science centric. It's mostly presentations and documents and things like that, both in Google Drive format and in Microsoft Word or PDFs and whatnot. And so we kind of showed like with the flexibility of our model, we can even use Kubernetes as one of these idle edge resources if it's needed. And so I will just briefly note that we follow a strong line of metadata extraction systems. So most of the ones that we've looked at were centralized. So Apache Tika is probably the most well-known. We compared against it briefly. There's also Science Search at LBNL, Clouder at UIUC, and Constellation at ORNL, or Oak Ridge. And so I would like to thank you all for listening. We'd also like to thank the people who provided the resources to make this possible, and also the groups that enabled us or gave us compute and made it possible, such as RCC at UChicago, JLSC, and ALCF at Argonne. So I will happily take any questions in 10 days.